Hello, thank you for your interest in going through the Security Year in Review for 2016. This material is provided by the Birmingham InfraGard, and I do have a couple little disclaimers here. These are my own thoughts. I'm Gary Warner, and I'll be your presenter today. Please respect our wishes with regards to this material in that we don't want this material to be posted on any other website. You're welcome to provide links to the Birmingham InfraGard website where we will have the material hosted. However, I do want to give permission, any InfraGard member who would like to use this material, either in your own chapter meetings or perhaps you'd like to use this material in your place of employment, you're welcome to do so. We encourage you to present this material to people who might benefit from it. But we do ask that you not share these slides by email or post them on any website. Just make a reference to the Birmingham InfraGard website if you'd like to use those. Obviously, copyright-wise, these are news sources that other people wrote. There are screenshots in here. There are pictures from websites, news sites primarily, some technical reports that other people wrote, and these are all sourced in my presenter notes. If you have the PowerPoint downloaded from our website, you'll see the URLs for everything that we use. As far as the assembling of them together, I will claim copyright on that, but feel free to use the materials or use the links in the materials to alter the presentation or make your own version for your own personal use. Again, we do ask that you only use the copy from the official Birmingham InfraGard website if you're going to present this yourselves. About me, I'm Gary Warner. I am an InfraGard member since 2001. We started our chapter in September of 2001, just the few days before the 9/11 incident, and it really has had a profound impact on everyone who attended that day. At that time, I was the IT director at an oil and gas company, and we were part of the critical infrastructure in that area. I've served both on the National Board for InfraGard and on the National Board of the Energy ISAC back in the early 2000s. Now I do cybercrime research and I teach computer forensics at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We'd love to have you visit our website, uab.edu. I'm also the chief threat scientist for PhishMe. The format for today is a calendar review of 2016. We're just going to walk through the year month by month, highlighting some interesting security events and especially calling attention to new risks or new types of cyber attack or new types of criminal elements that are working, but also paying attention to some great arrests and some great wins by the FBI and our other friends in law enforcement. So let's jump right into it. If I had to pick a theme for January, my theme is everyone is hacking. This news story was about Chris Correa. He was charged with 12 counts of hacking into the Astros computer network to steal information on recruiting prospects. Think about Moneyball if you're a baseball fan. How they choose their team and how they recruit their players is pretty important. When a Cardinals employee left to go join the Astros, Correa got access to his laptop and found the employee's password. Everybody knows that password reuse is a common theme in security. The fact that so many people use the same password in many locations, and that's what happened here. The employee who now worked at the Astros was using the same password to get into the Astros recruiting system as he used in the Cardinals organization, and Correa used that password that he'd gained from the employee laptop to allow him to basically shadow all of the recruiting activities of the Astros. In January, we'll come back to this case for several reasons, but we had several wins by the FBI against dark web websites. You'll be familiar with the Silk Road. You may be familiar with PedoBook, which was an operation called FBI's Operation Torpedo, Tor like the Tor network, and Pedo like PedoBook. And most recently, the Playpen site, which was called Operation Pacifier. Playpen was a site that had over 215,000 members signing up to receive child sexual exploitation images. Now, breaking Tor and allowing ways for the Tor network users to be exposed is something that the Vidalia team alumni Matt Edmond, who was at MITRE at the time, worked very hard on. He was responsible for a product called Cornhusker that was used to de-anonymize the PedoBook site. Pedo Book was hosted by a person from Omaha, Nebraska, which is where the Cornhusker name comes from. Matt continues to do this kind of work along with 3 of the FBI agents who were on the Silk Road case. Um, and the prosecutor for the Silk Road case, Todd Brown, also works with this group, and they continue to find interesting ways to de-anonymize Tor. Operation Pacifier was a global event. One of the sites was the Playpen site, but there was also an Australian site called Kid Club, and we don't know how many of these charges that were brought were part of Kid Club or Playpen or something else. But we do know that Operation Pacifier in Europol, they say it was responsible for 3,229 cases being generated. And we do believe there are also about 1,300 cases in the United States that were generated out of this. We don't know how many have gone to indictment, but we do know of about 137 that have been charged in the United States out of this case. One key guy in Denmark, according to this Europol presentation, had posted 3,696 photos and 116 videos of himself and his victims, and he was arrested while traveling to Romania to buy an infant. So how are they decloaking activities performed? Well, we do know that Metasploit had a decloaking engine, and the most successful part of that was 35 lines of flash code. Anybody who is running a Flash player inside of their browser when they visited a dark website could have their location revealed. Although decloak.net is gone, nothing disappears forever on the internet, and you can find a copy of that code at web.archive.org. This is part of the project that's called the Wayback Machine. Most recently, according to Wired magazine articles, the FBI has been using some custom Firefox exploits. And remember that the Tor browser is really just Firefox. Mozilla Firefox 45.5.1 is the base for the current version of the Tor browser, which right now I believe is 607. So if there are Firefox vulnerabilities, they are very probably present in Tor as well. Now, going on to other types of cyber espionage and cyber hacking, in January, we had this interesting trade that was part of the nuclear deal. We gave up several espionage agents for Iran who were working on breaking the sanctions in order to help the satellite development program in Iran and missile development in Iran, which we think was part of the nuclear program. Several people in particular were swapped as part of this nuclear deal with Iran. We gave up Nima Golestani. Nima had hacked a company called Aerotech and stolen a lot of aerodynamics software for Iran. There were also 3 people in Houston, Texas, who were using company Smart Power Systems to front purchases that were through shell companies ending up with the items being sent to Iran. Nader Modanlo received $10 million for his role in helping to broker a satellite launch deal with Russia for Iran. And Ali Subunshu was running a company called Ace Electric up in Maryland and was buying microelectronics that again were routed to Iran. These and 14 others who had their charges dropped were pardoned by the president. Who we got in exchange for this? We got a Washington Post journalist, a former Marine, a Christian pastor, and a businessman who had been held in Iran for various charges of espionage and other charges. Again, this prisoner swap was part of the nuclear deal. They'd actually asked for many more, but these are the ones we know about. There are in the presenter notes. There's a link to an article that has bios from the Daily Mail for each of those prisoners to give you a little bit more information about them. ISIS hacker Ardit Farizi. This is the guy who broke into a contractor who was serving the U.S. government by doing backgrounds on people. And as part of the data that he was able to hack, he produced what he called a kill list from the Islamic State hacking division. And they posted the photos and personal contact information for 1,300 U.S. military personnel, in some cases including their home addresses and some family information. Farizi was arrested in December, extradited in January, which is what this news story was about in January. He did plead guilty in June and was sentenced to 20 years in September. There was also some anti-ISIS hacking going on. These people are not well. These are hackers who claim that they're on a campaign to rid the world of ISIS websites, and to do so, they've gathered a large botnet that they're using and routinely DDoSing anything they find objectionable. So they DDoSed the BBC, for example. They DDoSed Donald Trump's website. They DDoSed the Black Lives Matter website. When they DDoSed BBC, they apologized and said, oh, that was supposed to be a brief test to show that we had the power to take ISIS websites offline. Just doesn't hold. In November, one of these members of this group was boasting that he had 220,000 malware-infected bots who were working on mining bitcoins for him. Those same bots are the size of the network that we can expect them to be able to use for DDoS attacks. The hacking group calls themselves New World Hacking. February, we had a lot of revelations about intelligence officials being hacked. These were led by a group called Crackers with Attitude. And the Crackers got into James Clapper's AOL account, John Brennan's account, Mark Giuliani, who's a FBI deputy director, and John Holdren, who is a science advisor for the White House. A 15-year-old and a 16-year-old were taken into custody in the United Kingdom over this case, but they had successfully breached the Law Enforcement Enterprise Portal, we call it LEAP, the JABS system, the Joint Automated Booking System, and the Internet Crime and Complaint Center. So you can just imagine what kind of damage they could get. Crack at one point boasted in a chat that's part of one of the criminal complaints in this case, I owned the entire DOJ, like all the DOJ agencies. So, and then he names a bunch of things that are not DOJ agencies, FBI, DEA, Interpol, and DHS. I'm sitting here with a list of 20,000 FBI employee names, country, email, phone numbers, titles, and he posted all of that on a site called CryptoBin. Mostly these guys were doing social engineering and just not caring at all about the consequences. So for example, he broke into Brennan's account by calling Verizon and posing as a Verizon employee to get the last 4 digits of his credit card. He then used that information to get AOL to reset his password. That's kind of the chain that these things work through. By the way, the list of FBI employees, I was sitting on a plane in Glasgow when this happened, and we were able to access the CryptoBin website, and I was able to find accurate contact information for everyone in the Birmingham FBI that I work with. So it was the actual data. February also had a pretty interesting case with the Bank of Bangladesh. This was a SWIFT attack. SWIFT is the system for doing international wire transfers, and someone had hacked in and planted malware which would mask the transactions. So the SWIFT wire transfers are normally logged, actually printed in most cases to a logging printer, and the malware would alter the logging so that these events did not get logged. Anyway, so the hackers tried to do 36 SWIFT wire transfers from Bank of Bangladesh, totaling $951 million, removing the money from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and wiring it somewhere else. 5 of those transfers, totaling $81 million, were completed, but an alert agent stopped the 6th one due to a typographical error. They were trying to wire money to the Shalika Foundation in Sri Lanka and instead spelled the word Foundation. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York employee contacted Bank of Bangladesh, confirmed this was not an authorized transfer, and canceled the rest of those 30 additional wire transfers. So of the $951 million attempted, only $81 million was sent. Now that $81 million went to RCBC, the Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation in the Philippines, and the money was immediately transferred to casino accounts controlled by 2 Chinese nationals. These guys run fishing boat junkets from China to bring gamblers down to gamble in the Philippines in several big casinos there. And there's a lot more information about this on my blog, which is in the notes. February, we also started seeing this wave of ransomware attacks hitting hospitals. February 5th, Hollywood Presbyterian Medical was hit with ransomware. They were asked to pay 40 Bitcoins in ransom, which at the time was $17,000, which they did. New Jersey Spine Center and Marin Healthcare District were also hit. And we'll talk more about this on a future month, but the SamSam ransomware was the primary family that we were seeing hitting hospitals. An interesting DDoS attack, this comes in the category of hacktivism, someone associated with Anonymous, or self-identifying as Anonymous, I guess would be a better way to say it, believed that a teenager who had been taken away from their parents was actually being tortured, according to his interpretation of events. The kid was on all kinds of pain medications, and as the hospital tried to break them from the pain medications, the teen was sneaking messages out about her torture, which this guy took on as a cause. So during Boston Children's Hospital's annual fundraising event, he led a DDoS campaign against the hospital, preventing their fundraising site to be able to be accessed. Now, an interesting twist of events, he ended up on a sailboat near the coast of Cuba, stranded and in distress, and was rescued by a Disney cruise ship, who then they arrested him, actually, at that time because of the DDoS attacks. February also saw a bunch of data breaches, particularly in university space. We'll see as we go through the year that universities and healthcare systems do not have the same level of security as most organizations, most large organizations, and this does result in more breaches and more malware outbreaks at those type of organizations. So February 4th, for example, University of Central Florida had 63,000 patient records breached. I include Jacksonville State University not because of the size of the breach, but because it's in Alabama where I live. Jacksonville State, some students, one of them working as an intern at the university, were able to download a ton of information about the students, including their name, photo, student ID, fraternity or sorority affiliation, and birth date, and posted that information on a private website that they were controlling. And then University of California, Berkeley had 80,000 student records breached as well. Those same New World hackers we heard about in January now took down Xbox Live, boasting that, again, they're just testing their power. They plan to take down major ISIS channels next month, and it seemed the perfect time to do a test, said the member Access Root on his Twitter page. Obviously, these guys are just loose cannons. Whatever they may or may not do against ISIS certainly doesn't justify their hacking of legitimate businesses and companies. A lot of tax issues coming in. The February tax season issues, the IRS started off by admitting that the Get Transcript service that they ran on their website had been used to download over 724,000 U.S. citizens' data. And that was quite an issue. During some testimony the IRS Commissioner Koskinen gave at the Senate, he talked about the fact they have 1,700 open investigations being worked by 400 IRS criminal investigations agents. You may not know that the IRS has a fantastic law enforcement branch. They work under Treasury's Office of the Inspector General, a group called TIGTA, and do some fantastic work. In 2015, they were able to stop 1.4 million fraudulent returns that attempted to steal $8.7 billion. And in fact, one of the scams that we've seen a lot of is these IRS phishing alerts. In this scam, it's similar to the business email compromise. It could be considered one form of business email compromise. Someone claiming to be the CEO of an organization sends an email to someone who's a HR or payroll professional and asks them for a list of all of the W-2 data for all of the employees. If your CEO emails you and asks you for a list of all the company employees, you need to check that out somehow before you just submit to the request. Unfortunately, this led to a lot of big problems. Seagate was an example that was talked about by Brian Krebs and others as someone who had given up their W-2 info for all employees. Snapchat was also on the list. There's Evening Post, Acronis, Moneytree, Perkin Elmer, Sprouts Farmers Market, Advanced Auto Parts, Mainline Health, and others. Steve Reagan, who does a great column called Salted Hash over at CSO Magazine, has documented a list of 41 different organizations who fell prey to this W-2 scam. And the thing you need to understand is that the criminals have a way to take a list of W-2s and automatically generate tax returns for those employees. They can file all of the tax returns for an entire company in just a couple of hours through automation. And what they do is they cause the tax refund to be sent to accounts that they control rather than the person who should be receiving the tax refund. Moving into March, we finally got a ringleader for one of the unlimited ATM attacks. If you're not familiar with an unlimited ATM attack, the idea is that criminals breach a network and gain access to the system that sets the limits for the daily withdrawal limit and has the ability to reset the daily withdrawal limit or the balance. Basically, they can cause a transaction to be canceled. So once they get into that part of a system in a banking situation, the first and most famous of these was RBS WorldPay, where some criminals stole $91 million in a 24-hour, I'm sorry, $9.1 million in a 24-hour period. This guy, Erkan Findikoglu, I don't know how you say, has a responsibility for 3 unlimited attacks. The first one in February of 2011, he stole $10 million from American Red Cross disaster relief cards, which were drawn from JP Morgan Chase. Basically, he took 20 prepaid debit cards, cloned the mag stripes and sent them all over the world. And in 18 different countries, teams of money withdrawal specialists were working for him and were able in a short period of time, less than 24 hours, to do 15,000 ATM withdrawals from these 20 accounts. And basically, again, the balance keeps getting reset on the cards, so you can basically take an unlimited number of funds. You're only limited by how much cash is in the ATMs that you have physical access to. In December 2012, they did it again. This time it was an Indian-based company called ECS, and their bank was Ras Al Khaimah in the UAE. They did 5,000 transactions in one day from 20 different countries against a small number of cards. And then in February of 2013, Endstage, which I believe is in California, using cards drawn on the Bank Muscat from Oman, Jordan, had 36,000 ATM withdrawals on a small number of cards in 24 different countries, and they got away with $40 million in 24 hours. So Erkan, who called himself either Seagate or Predator online, was arrested while visiting Germany. I do want to share some malware trends. We'll look again at the third quarter, I believe, at this way. As I mentioned in the intro, I do have a responsibility as a chief threat scientist at PhishMe. The Intel team here in Birmingham for PhishMe does many malware reports every day, and then we do a quarterly wrap-up of those to share trends. In the first quarter, 2 of the big trends were that we saw a huge increase in the number of Office documents being attached to emails with hostile code within them that were then used to drop mostly banking Trojans. So Dridex and NeverQuest are the 2 banking Trojans that just in the first quarter between them we saw almost 90 campaigns where an Office macro either dropped Dridex or NeverQuest. The other big trend was using JavaScript to be the dropper, and JavaScript was mostly being used by Locky and TeslaCrypt. And again, between them, we saw over 125 campaigns in the first quarter where either the Locky ransomware or the TeslaCrypt ransomware was being dropped by an attachment that contained JavaScript. When the JavaScript executes in your browser, you're infected. In March, we had a hospital in Kentucky near us here in the south. MethodistHospital.net posted that they were having an internal state of emergency due to a computer virus. I believe that screenshot came from Brian Krebs. MedStar Hospital is one of a dozen hospitals that were hit with SamSam ransomware in a single weekend. According to Talos Security, which is a group that's owned by Cisco, the criminals were using a hacking tool called JexBoss to gain access to JBoss application servers. So JBoss is a plugin for your Apache web browser. A lot of applications that are run on Apache will use JBoss. And so what's happening here is that they're attacking hospitals that they know to have an application that uses JBoss. And by putting the malware into the JBoss server, as hospital computers connect to that website in order to do their medical records work, their machine then is encrypted by the SamSam ransomware. These hackers are demanding 1 Bitcoin per machine, or they'll do bulk decrypts for 22 Bitcoins. A big ad network ransomware happened. The Angler exploit kit was deployed on a bunch of different sites that used an advertisement. This is one example. This is an ad for some socket wrenches. And the advertisement, basically, after it gets approved by the ad network, was swapped to contain the Angler exploit kit. And this ad was displayed on MSN, NFL, New York Times, Answers.com, the Weather Network, Newsweek, AOL, Xfinity Radio, and many other locations. And what it was dropping was the TeslaCrypt ransomware. And so this led to millions of machines actually being exposed to the ransomware. The Angler exploit kit, we believe, has about a 17% success rate. So if you visit an Angler exploit kit website, you're only going to be infected if your machine is not currently patched, but most machines have at least one vulnerability because they try many different delivery mechanisms, possibly as many as 30 different ways of breaking into your system. If you visit the web page, the iframe that's loaded in the ad will cause all of these attacks to be attempted against your machine. If even one of them succeeds, then the payload is dropped, which again in this case was the TeslaCrypt ransomware. In March, we tell a joke. I'm a big fan of the FBI, I'm big friends of the FBI. We sometimes tell the joke, who's going to have a case brought for having their email account hacked? Well, you pretty much have to be a politician or a naked celebrity if you're going to have your case investigated. If somebody hacks my Gmail account, I'm pretty sure nobody's going to care. But it turns out if you're a beautiful celebrity with naked pictures, then suddenly you can find someone who's willing to work on the case. That's meant in good fun. Sorry if any FBI folks are offended by that. It's a joke. Anyway, Ryan Collins was the guy who was arrested in this situation. He had hacked into 120 different Gmail and iCloud accounts, including celebrities like Kirsten Dunst, Kate Upton, and Jennifer Lawrence, and leaked nude photos of them in an event that was called The Fappening. He's a 36-year-old Pennsylvania resident, and he got 18 months in prison in October, but he was arrested here in March. Now, there were 7 Iranians freed for cyber espionage and supply chain espionage. Interesting that we then indicted 7 Iranian hackers 2 months later. I love this story. Nitrogen 26 actually is a hacker that we'd been looking at back in 2010. He had been part of a group that was calling themselves the Sun Army and who were doing attacks against NASA. But anyway, 7 hackers indicted. The FBI said that they were doing attacks against 46 different financial sector organizations in the time frame from 2011 to 2013. That would be about the time of the Al-Qassam cyber fighters. So we do believe this is talking about the Al-Qassam cyber fighter attacks, doing the DDoS attacks against the major banks in that time, protesting the Prophet Muhammad video on YouTube that they didn't like. We don't like this YouTube video, so we should DDoS your bank. The logic escapes me, but that's what was happening. Anyway, they've been indicted. Will they ever go to jail? We don't know, but they're certainly going to if they travel to the United States. April, we had the sentencing for the hackers who were behind the SpyEye malware. Fantastic FBI agent Mark Ray from Atlanta came to Birmingham and presented about this case back in the summer of 2015. Fantastic agent. The 2 guys that were charged, and both are now in prison in Atlanta, Hamza Bendalaj was called the Smiling Hacker. He's actually done a testimonial that's been shared widely within the ISIS communities about how he felt like hacking on behalf of Allah was a good thing to do. He's from Algeria. And then Alexander Panin was his partner in crime. He's from Russia. Panin got 9 years. Bendalaj got 15 years. He was known in the underground as Grubodemon or Harderman, both of those aliases. We also had a successful extradition. Guccifer, who is the reason we know about the Hillary Clinton emails, was extradited from Romania. Guccifer was another one, kind of like the guys we talked about a few minutes ago, the crackers with attitude, who routinely broke into the government officials' email accounts, not just in the U.S. but also throughout Romania and many places in Europe. I think it was more than 100 officials had their emails breached by this guy. Anyway, his real name Marcel Lazar, age 44. He was sentenced to 52 months in September, but this story in April was about him coming to the United States. He was charged with aggravated identity theft and unauthorized access to a protected computer. This one was an interesting one. A lot of companies are so afraid of DDoSes that they're allowing themselves to be victims of extortion. This story was broke by the CEO of Cloudflare in a very good blog. Matthew Prince is the CEO of Cloudflare. Does a lot of good work. Their company gets a bad rep from time to time because tons of criminals use their service to protect themselves from having their IP addresses exposed. But Prince and his team are fantastic people who work very closely with law enforcement and always honor subpoenas, and it's a mixed bag. There are a lot of criminals using their service, but they're also very friendly to law enforcement. Anyway, this particular story is about a group that was called the Armada Collective, and you can see the email on the left. You would get a scary email like this that says, forward this email to whoever is important in your company and can make a decision. And basically they're saying that if you don't give them 10 Bitcoins, they're going to do a DDoS attack against you. And by the way, they have the power to do a 1 terabit per second DDoS. And if you don't pay them and they start the DDoS, the price will go up 10 Bitcoins per day until you pay them. So shouldn't you just pay them 10 Bitcoins now and save yourself the hassle? Unfortunately, according to the blockchain analysis that Cloudflare and their team did, the Armada Collective, which we believe was formerly known as DDoS for Bitcoin, DD4BC, collected over $100,000 in protection extortion money, and no one, as far as we can tell, was ever DDoSed by either group, DD4BC or the Armada Collective. So this was a total spoof, but they made over $100,000 in extortion fees. This may happen to your organization, so be aware that just because there's making an extortion threat doesn't mean that they actually exist. It'd be worth doing some homework before you decide how to handle that. Now remember Operation Pacifier that we talked about earlier. Operation Pacifier was the case where we had the Tor network was hiding the true identity of different organizations. In this case, a magistrate in the Eastern District of Virginia authorized a NIT. It's a Network Investigative Technique. We used to call them web bugs, but a NIT was used to identify the IP addresses of the subscribers to the largest child sexual exploitation dark website. And the problem is that one of the people who was charged under this, a guy named Levin, moved to suppress the evidence, saying that the NIT warrant was invalid because it voided for want of jurisdiction under the Federal Magistrates Act, Section 636, and under the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 41, basically saying that magistrate had no business authorizing a warrant for me because I don't live in their district. And if we look at what Rule 41B says, it says a magistrate judge with authority in the district has authority to issue a warrant to search for and seize a person or property located within the district. Okay, unfortunately, the Levin was in, I believe, Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is not part of the Eastern District of Virginia, and the ruling that came down from the judge in this case was that based on the analysis, the court concludes the NIT warrant was without jurisdiction and thus was void ab initio. That means from the beginning it didn't exist. So because there was then no NIT warrant, then they never could have learned the IP address. And because they wouldn't have learned the IP address, they certainly couldn't use the IP address as the basis for doing a search at Levin's place of residence. And so Levin's search, and by extension, every search that was generated from this NIT warrant is null and void. That means Levin walks and all of these other pedophiles walk. Now, the immediate reaction to that, of course, was to file a request for a change. The way the rules of criminal procedure work is that a council of judges reviews the current rules of procedure and proposes any changes to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court then either accepts those recommendations or rejects them. If they accept them, they send notice to the Congress. And the form of the notice is, these are the changes that will be made to the rules of criminal procedure unless you make congressional action to block them before December 1st of this year. So December 1st was the deadline to see whether the Rule 41 changes should go in. This is what it's about. It's about being able to serve legal process on someone who is anonymizing themselves with Tor, or as we'll see in a little bit, fast flux networks. A fast flux primarily for malware distribution. So we'll talk more about this as we get to December. In May, we had more ransomware against hospitals. This was a hospital in Kansas who paid their ransom, and then the extortionist said, well, we want more ransom. And so even though they paid their money, they were not allowed to unlock their data and were actually placed under a demand to pay a larger ransom. That's one of the warnings when you're dealing with criminals that might happen to you. You might give them your money and have another threat come in, especially with the SamSam guys. Be on notice. That's what happens here. Now, there was a very interesting case related to MySpace accounts and LinkedIn accounts. This is a hacker. The media called her or him Peace, but the hacker name they use is Tessa88. And what you can see on this pair of website shots here, one is FuckAV. These people don't like antivirus companies apparently. And the other one is WMasterRU. And let's see, and that's from blackboxes.ru. What these are saying is they're offering very large collections of user IDs and passwords. So they're saying we have 137 million vContact accounts, we have 6 million Mobongo accounts, we have 380 million MySpace accounts, 126 Badoo accounts, 101 million Rambler accounts, 103 million Dropbox accounts, and we'll sell them to you. Give us Bitcoin. And so the hacker then went on to announce in a second round of announcements in May that they also had vBulletin. Now, when you download vBulletin, the online forum software, you register with vBulletin with a user ID and password. And that's the user ID and password that was breached here. If you then use that same user ID and password to be the administrator of your board, you get all kinds of problems. LBSG is a mobile phone app developer for video games. Their leading game is called Lifeboat. R2 Games is also a mobile game developer that had 22 million accounts dumped. Fling is a sex dating site. And then LinkedIn, they were claiming at this time they had 200 million LinkedIn accounts. And they also were claiming here that they had 30 million identities from the state of Washington. I haven't seen the media on that one, but that was part of the same claim. Now, LinkedIn confirmed that the data was theirs, although, again, they say it was 120 million accounts, not 200 million accounts. But basically, all the LinkedIn user IDs and passwords for 100 million accounts. The theft had happened back in 2012, and LinkedIn was very upfront, prolific about getting the news out that you need to change your password. They basically did, and everybody gets a new password reset. And they also use this as a campaign to encourage people to have two-step verification. So for instance, when I log into LinkedIn, it sends a text message to my phone and I have to put a code in on my phone. That really should be best practice for everything. Your Facebook, your Twitter, your Gmail, whatever you have, should be using two-factor authentication. Anyway, interesting case though. The hacker would be selling such old data. Remember again, password reuse. How many of those people, that 100 million people with a password in 2012, are still using the same password for some things today? With bulk password checkers, the hackers have panels where you can upload a list of user IDs and passwords, and they will spray them across hundreds of online sites, seeing if those same user IDs and passwords work on any of those additional sites. So that's the risk there. It's about password reuse. In June, Spamford Wallace finally went to jail. This is a spam king that has been active in spam very outspoken about his activities with regards to spam since the late 90s. I mean, he's done national news television interviews where he boasts about how much spam he sends. Well, he had compromised 500,000 Facebook accounts by causing the already compromised accounts to send links to their friends that when they clicked on the link would pop up a Facebook phishing page to steal their user ID and password. Once they were compromised, Spamford had the ability to then send on advertising through all of these sites. Now, he was under a court order to never again log into Facebook, and the event that triggered this arrest was he violated the court order. So in addition to the charges for phishing that he was already up against, he now admitted to hacking 500,000 Facebook accounts and sending over 27 million messages through these hacked accounts, and he's been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Good for him. May it be more. Now, the top spamming botnet sending out ransomware was called Locky, and we'll look at some of Locky's record-breaking spam volumes in a little bit. But the idea here is that Locky was extremely prevalent from February until June, or May 31st. The top malware distributed during that time frame was the Locky ransomware, and it was all coming from a spamming botnet called Neckers. Now, the Neckers botnet disappeared. On June 1st, it just went away. We saw no activity. There were no Locky campaigns distributed for almost 3 weeks in June, and everybody was wondering what's going on. Malware Tech is a fantastic tool for tracking botnets. If you own a large network, subscribing to their service will allow you to be alerted when your IP addresses are seen as part of one of the botnets that they're tracking. But they sized the botnet in May at 6.1 million active nodes over the course of the month, and then it dropped to 0. Now, in December, the single day count is that in one day, December 13th, they saw over 1 million active Neckers bots, and again, Locky is back in action. So it's recently very active, but it's been active ever since late June. There's a lot of theories on where it went, and the best theory I've seen comes from Nick Biasini, sorry if I said that wrong, at Talos. Talos, again, is owned by Cisco. Nick put together a fantastic blog, really technical, but it gets deep. The link is in the notes. And he was pointing out that a bunch of domains registered by this John Brunig K at yahoo.co.uk were being used to deliver Angler payloads, which was one way that Locky was very popularly delivered. It was being used for the Lurk banking Trojan, and it was being used for the Neckers command and control. So domains that were the command and control for Neckers were registered by the same guy who was doing a lot of the Angler and Lurk payloads. So the idea is that when an arrest was made that took down this guy who ran that account, a lot of Angler dropped off, the Lurk banking Trojan totally disappeared, and Neckers stopped working. The theory is that Neckers stopped working because its command and control domains were seized, and it took a while for someone else to bring to build up a new command and control infrastructure. And once that new infrastructure was in place, the Locky spam began again. Note though that the Dridex spam did not begin again. In July, another interesting case. I was disappointed here. I mean, what's the worst thing you could do in the world of cyber espionage? What about stealing all of the plans for military aircraft and weapon systems? So this guy was said to have stolen a tremendous amount of data, over 65 gigabytes over a 2-year period, and had stolen plans for dozens of US military projects. And his sentence, though, was 46 months and a $10,000 fine. The sentencing memo, if you're a legal geek, you will love the sentencing memo. The notice in the link to the sentencing memo is in the notes. And a 37-page document. The U.S. military suggests that the data that he stole had a value of $1.5 million. Now, as is commonly the case, they charge a lesser value, in this case, exactly half. They took the $1.5 million estimate and charged him with stealing data valued at $742,177.50. And that's, anyway, read the sentencing memo if this is your kind of thing, but very disappointed with the sentence and yet very glad that the guy was arrested. We'll see what happens with similar cases, but similar to the Iran case that we talked about in January, this guy's basically stealing military secrets, stealing electronics, working in the supply chain area. In July, the National Crime Agency in the UK did something that I consider very brave, and I would love to see the United States follow this suit. What happened is that they've been beginning to gather in their annual cybercrime assessment, or their annual crime assessment, data not just about physical crimes, but about cybercrimes. And they've put together a framework for collecting information about cybercrime victimization, where just like in the United States, we have the Uniform Crime Reporting System, the UCR, where all the state and local jurisdictions report property and violent crimes up, and then we have national statistics about how those crimes happened and how often and what was the level of victimization for each of those types of crimes. And we use that data to justify budgets and decision making about law enforcement. But there is no data about cybercrime. We are not gathering national statistics. The NCA, again, power to them, gathered the data. They had actually 700,000 reported cases of fraud and 2.1 million cybercrime victims that were identified. Now, a second project run by Action Fraud, which is similar to RIC3.gov. Action Fraud is a government website for collecting fraud reports in the UK, says that based on their survey numbers, they believe there may have been 3.8 million fraud cases. So the delta between the unreported or underreported crimes is that difference between 3.8 million fraud and 700,000 fraud cases. The truth, though, is that what this established as fact was there is more cybercrime than any other category of crime. There are more cybercrime victims than all other types of victims. And we need to move our game up to have the same level of reporting in the United States. And it's on the plans. There is a new crime reporting system that I believe has to be accepted nationally by 2020. So we're on the way, but it's probably going to be 4 more years before we get to the point where the US and the UK are playing on the same level now. For those of you who follow mobile devices, we continue to say that there really aren't mobile malware cases in the United States at scale. But what's happening in China should continue to put a warning on the horizon. In China, a company that Check Point has labeled them as humming bad, the company is actually Hummingbird, but there's a group there called Yingmob, and Yingmob is earning approximately $300,000 a month in fraudulent advertising revenue. And the way they've done it is they've planted malware on 10 million Android devices and a very large number of iOS devices, not nearly as bad as the Android device number. And basically those two products, Hummingbird and Yispector and Hummingbird, are basically intercepting your attempts by your phone to reach an ad network and sending an ad instead of from the ad network. The ad goes from a ad network that's controlled by Yingmob. And so they're basically acting as an advertising agency, promising they can get ads delivered to mobile phones, and then doing it by the fact that they've planted malware on these devices. Ransomware in hospitals, continuing the trend. Here's the important part of this slide. Do you see on the Marin Healthcare and on the Rainbow Children's Clinic, the item about lost patient records? So Marin chose not to pay the ransom, which is very noble and moral, and I like it. The problem is that their backups didn't actually include a daily backup that would capture all medical records. And so for a period from July 11th to July 2016, public sources are saying that there are about 5,000 patients whose medical records are either lost or partially lost. And the idea is that that's the delta from when they got hacked with the ransomware that locked down the system and when the last full backup was. Patients who had new information added to their medical records, or perhaps new patients coming in, that data of what happened while they were in the clinic is lost. And you may know that HIPAA has a clause with where HHS, Health and Human Services, has an office that will fine companies for improper medical record handling. Unfortunately, there's about a 3-year lag between the reports and the fine process going into place. So currently, as we said at the end of 2016, they're still giving fines for cases that happened in 2013. It'll be interesting to see what happens when these ransomware cases get to HIPAA's HHS Office of Enforcement. But be very aware of this and what the implications could be if you can't access patient healthcare records. And in fact, a study that was done by a company called Security Scorecard talks about the fact that when it comes to being aware of phishing, there are problems within this industry. They say that of the healthcare industry, that their preparation for social engineering emails, phishing emails, out of 18 industries, they rank them as number 15. And they rank them as far as their preparation. As far as data breaches, healthcare is the number 5 industry for the number and volume of data breaches that have been occurring. Education is number 1. We talked earlier about the fact that universities are having a lot of data breaches. They're actually the number 1 category of data breaches is education. Healthcare is number 5. And if we look at the healthcare breaches for this year, quarter 1 we had at least 63 major breaches, quarter 2 89, quarter 3 118. All of those are higher than any quarter within 2015. I love this case. I blogged about it. I'd love for you to read the more details there. We don't have time for all of it now, but Roman Seleznev is the son of a Duma official in Russia, and he's a major criminal. The way this case worked, though, a very fantastic Seattle police detective, David Dunn, who now works for FIS, Fidelity, David Dunn got called in on a point-of-sale malware case where a certain pizza restaurant in Seattle was having credit cards stolen from them. And as David took the machine and analyzed it, he found that there was malware on the machine that was stealing the credit cards and sending them to a particular computer. Well, using legal process and working through the Electronic Crimes Task Force of the Secret Service, David was able to get monitoring up on that computer and to pull trap and trace what are all the IP addresses that are talking to that computer. He then went and found which of those IP addresses were also in the Seattle area, and as he visited various restaurants in Seattle, found that they were all point-of-sale terminals in restaurants that were sending all of their credit cards to this computer in North Carolina. Now, as the case advanced, David collected the credit cards, got the evidence that it was Seleznev, and when Seleznev eventually was nabbed, he had with him a very large number of credit cards, and when these credit cards were investigated, they were found to have been from 3,700 financial institutions, and that those cards had directly resulted in $160 million in losses. And so that was the base of the case. He was using point-of-sale malware that he planted himself on hacked point-of-sale terminals, and then had all the data go back to his server that he ran command and control on, and then he would market those credit cards to third parties. He pled guilty in August and was supposed to be sentenced here in December. He used a legal loophole to basically, he declared his counsel to be incompetent and he needed new counsel. And the act of gaining new counsel, now he has to have time to brief the new counsel. So instead of being sentenced on December 6th, his sentencing is now delayed until February of 2017. This one, I can't say this is factual, but I can tell you about the story. A series of unprecedented fires, including 3 nearly simultaneous industrial fires in Iran, has caused Iran's Supreme National Cyberspace Council to state that they were investigating whether the fires were involving a malware attack link. And they confirmed that at least 2 of the plants were found to have industrial malware that would have controlled the pressure and flow of oil and chemicals through these the 42-inch pipe in one case that blew up. So a 42-inch pipe basically ruptured, causing a fire in one of these petrochemical complexes because it was feeding too much pressure into the pipe. The industrial control system should have prevented that, and it did not, and malware was found to be present on that machine. Now, over the course of the summer, I believe there were 9 major fires that happened at petrochemical plants, causing millions of dollars of damage and loss of human life in many cases. And they were being investigated to see if it was malware related. Don't know that it was, but we'll come back to that. A beautiful case in August, a BEC scammer that is known as Mike was arrested in Nigeria. This was an example of the security industry, in this case Trend Micro, working with law enforcement. So Interpol and the FBI and the Nigerian Economic and Financial Crimes Commission really worked together on this case. This guy was found to have stolen $60 million from victims, with one victim losing $15 million. And notice that he's really not targeting the United States. Trend gave a map of where were the victims, and only 5% of them were in the US. Where he's going after is Malaysia and India. Almost 40% of his victims were either Malaysian or Indian. And this has to do with the sophistication of the average user. The online banking world is kind of new to some parts of the world, and they make better victims. The malware in this case was called Predator Pain. Trend Micro has a great paper on that, and he was dropping a keylogger on these machines as well that was called the Limitless keylogger. Again, I'd refer you to the notes to read more about the Trend Micro reports on this. But because Trend was able to connect the dots on so many infected victims and share that information with Interpol and others, we were able to get this arrest, not just of Mike, but I believe there were 65 individuals that got arrested. More on the crackers with attitudes, the guys that hit the intelligence community pretty hard with the breaches we talked about back in February. 2 Americans turned out to be collaborating with them. Andrew Boggs from North Carolina and Justin Liverman, also from North Carolina, were in pretty much constant chat with the 2 teenage hackers in the UK. Kraka, the guy in the UK, was the first one to gain access to Leap, and as soon as he did, that was the law enforcement portal, as soon as he did, he contacted Liverman. Liverman says, hey, we should name and shame all of the police officers in Miami related to a shooting event that had happened. And so Liverman and Kraka dumped the personal contact information for a bunch of Miami police officers and posted online. Now, the involvement for Boggs was a little bit different. Boggs wasn't into naming and shaming police officers as a form of counter-protest. Boggs was looking for proof of government involvement with aliens. Typical nut job. But anyway, so Boggs, who called himself Incursio, and Liverman, who called himself Default or Shinoda, those 2 guys were captured because of the fact that they would log into Twitter from the cable modem of their parents. The 22-year-old and the 24-year-old were both residing with their parent, and tracking the IP address they used on their Twitter accounts back to their parents' residence is how these 2 ended up to be apprehended. By the way, after they got locked out of Deputy Director Giuliano's account, they attempted to social engineer their way back. Leap recorded 34 different help desk calls where they believe the person on the line was one of these 2 guys trying to work their way back through social engineering to get control of additional accounts. And CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information System, had the same thing where they believe 56 of their help desk calls are actually recordings of Crackers with Attitudes members trying to social engineer their way back into accounts. And again, by this time, they had a lot more accounts to deal with. They had enough personal information to make a pretty good play at really any one of 20,000 different FBI and DHS officials, by having enough to possibly answer some of the questions that might be asked for unlocking an account. In September, I wanted to talk about Locky again. Spam volumes, estimates of global spam volumes vary, but typically you can look at the ratio. So if Trend Micro saw that on September 11th there were 80 billion spam messages, and on September 16th there were 428 billion messages, that may or may not be the best number for what the global volume of spam was, but it would be a fair estimate that spam went up by at least fourfold between September 11th and September 16th. Now, that's a little misleading. Spam volumes always drop on the weekend. The spammers realize business people aren't checking their email as often on the weekend, and so they don't bother to send spam on the weekend. Monday through Friday spam is always higher, ramping up, where Monday is a low day and Tuesday through Friday are your peak days. And so that's a weekly cycle. The point here is that 428 billion spam messages in a day is spam that's operating at about a 10-year high. So over the last several years, actually spam has been decreasing in volume, and what we saw here was it growing up in volume instead. Some other things going on in September, I didn't really get into the Krebs aspects of this so much because the Brian Krebs DDoS is famous in our community. Nobody could not know about that. But Krebs, it's interesting, Prolexic and then later Akamai, who purchased Prolexic, was protecting Krebs on security from DDoS attacks from August of 2011 through September of 2016. During that time, they had 269 DDoS attacks against him. And the two highest ones there at the end, September 20th, they had a 623 gigabit per second attack, and on September 22nd, a 550 gigabit per second attack, which was a volume that Akamai says would have cost them $1 million a day to keep Brian Krebs online. So they really had no choice but to drop him. Fortunately, he was picked up by Google through a new freedom program that they have for protecting journalists and people at risk of cyber attack. For a lot more details like this, look at the Akamai Q3 DDoS report, which really talks about some of the trends. DDoS is up quarter over quarter with a slight drop from quarter three to from quarter two, but a huge volume increase over what things were looking like in 2015. Here's their caution though, and I would echo it and totally agree with it. The winter holiday season has long been characterized by a rise in the number of DDoS attacks, and malicious actors now have a new tool, the Internet of Things fueled botnets, that is likely to be used again. There is a 100% possibility that we're going to see IoT-based DDoS attacks against major retailers and major gaming companies over the Christmas holidays. Just look forward to it. It's going to happen. The IoT, the Internet of Things, is really being abused in a tremendous way. A researcher in my lab, Max Gannon here at UAB, routinely downloads the configs from these IoT DDoSes. One that he looked at earlier this week had 16 hard-coded user IDs and passwords and a list of 22 million IP addresses that they already had access to. So just think of a single botnet actor who knows the user ID and password of 22 million Internet of Things devices. What could you do with 22 million, even if it's 1 megabit per second? 22 million is a huge, huge amount of attacking systems. We're going to see attacks of that level. Right now, the best news in the IoT, and the Mirai is the name of the botnet that is most famous, but there are many competitors. The best news is that there are so many people attacking these IoT devices that a sustained DDoS would be difficult just because there's so many other people trying to take over the same boxes. And the vulnerability that allows the first DDoSer to get in really can't be patched to prevent the second DDoSer from taking control of that node away from him. Um, and that's one of the techniques we're seeing very commonly used. When they get on a box, the first thing they do is run a history command and kill any processes that have been recently launched on that device. So they may not know the name of the predecessor hacker's IoT device botnet, but they can look at recently launched processes and kill the process out of memory using that technique. Anyway, the Akamai Q3 DDoS report, very much worth reading their quarterly report. It's called the State of the Internet. VeriSign also does a Q3 DDoS report. VeriSign has a smaller customer base in this area, but they've observed a similar trend, meaning that they've been seeing financial services and media and entertainment really having an uptick in the size of their DDoS attacks, with many of the attacks growing over 200 gigabits per second. So if you look at that financial sector there, Q4 of 2015, their attacks were under 50 gig, and you see it grow to like 130, 180, and then 270 or 260 in just the quarter-over-quarter growth of the size of DDoS attacks against financial services companies. Back to the PhishMe malware report. This is the Q3 report. This is just to point out the dominance of Locky. As we have spam that's delivering ransomware, at the beginning of the year, we had many competing families. So we had TeslaCrypt, CryptoWall, CBT Locker, and others that were being delivered. February, Locky comes on the scene and is immediately has as many campaigns as TeslaCrypt, and then it just kind of goes nuts. In March, almost everything we saw by ratio were campaigns for Locky. And so this chart's showing the number of campaigns that we saw, and you see the dip in June, which was due to the extended shutdown of the underlying Necker spamming software. But you can see that Locky has pretty much been the dominant email delivered ransomware for the year. When we look at it in a slightly different way, though, it's even worse than that. This 97.25 number, what this is talking about is not the number of campaigns. So on the left, you see that in the first quarter, we analyzed 103 Locky campaigns, 124 Locky campaigns in Q2, and 193 Locky campaigns in Q3. The 97.25% is the number of email messages. So where a TeslaCrypt email campaign might have had a few hundred samples found by our tools, we were seeing 100,000 or 150,000 emails when we were looking at the Locky campaigns. So just the ratio of almost all of the malware that we're looking at that's coming in through email, that especially that delivering ransomware, is Locky. The volumes are just ridiculous. 100,000 of one and 100 of the other. 150,000 of one and 50 of the other. So anyway, this timeline, which I would encourage you just to download the report to look at in more detail. We're not going to get into it all, but it's just talking about some of the observations we made over the course of 2016 so far on how the Locky ransomware has changed over time. Healthcare breaches, I think I may have already beaten this drum. This chart, though, is showing the number of patient records that were revealed. Protenus is a company that monitors healthcare data breaches and tries to, they do a monthly report about how many patient records have been exposed. And you see those very large numbers in June and August, 11 million and 8 million in data breaches. In October, 40% of the breaches were related to hacking and malware, but it's considered, should be considered that 37% of the data breaches involved insider data theft. So although healthcare data breaches do have a lot to do with the ransomware and the malware that we're seeing, there's also still a very large problem with insider data theft in this industry. One of my favorite cases of the year, you remember those annoying phone calls that you've all heard about where people call and they'll say that they're the IRS, and because you failed to pay your taxes, if you don't pay a fine right now while we're on the phone together, they're going to have you arrested immediately. Well, there's another variant of that that's the local law enforcement one. So here in Alabama, we've had dozens of complaints to my lab where people are calling and saying, hey, the Shelby County Sheriff's Office or the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office or the Birmingham Police Department just called and made a threat that if I didn't pay a fine, they were going to have me immediately arrested. There's also an immigrations and customs version of this where they call internationals and tell them they're going to be deported if they don't pay a fine. Well, these call centers are all running out of a city called Gujarat in India. And what this diagram that I put together is showing is the relationship between the people running the call centers back in Gujarat have recruited Americans who are running networks of runners. So especially a couple of Patel guys up in Willowbrook, Illinois, these guys are the liaisons basically between this network of call centers. This particular chart is about one called H Global, and runners that they have in Illinois, Georgia, Alabama, New Jersey, Indiana, California, Florida, and Texas that were all named in this indictment, where basically the runner's job is to figure out what is a good local law enforcement agency for me to imitate, what's the name of a prominent detective there that I could drop, what caller ID should I set in my phone if I want to appear to be these guys. And the way it works then is that they receive and process the local funds, those runners do. So there's a local fund that then gets sent up to the Patel guys up in Willowbrook that then gets shared with the people running the call centers. And according to some numbers in the IRS, there are possibly 10,000 people involved in doing these calls. Well, so the action here really focused on the technique that they use for faking that caller ID. MagicJack is a voice over IP telephone service that you can plug in that will allow you to set your caller ID to anything you want it to be. So they're using MagicJack phone emulator, I guess they're phones, MagicJack hardware to set their caller ID to be the Shelby County, Alabama Sheriff's Office. And then these people in India are making the phone calls claiming to be Detective Smith from the Shelby County Sheriff's Office. How they were, in most cases, how they were getting the money collected is they would have the person go to the store and buy what's called a Green Dot Money Pack. Now, a Green Dot Money Pack is, if I have that voucher number, I have your cash. So if I take a $300 money pack and I send you the voucher number, you can cash out that number anywhere in the world. Well, Green Dot is owned by eBay. And through this investigation, they realized that some of those MagicJack telephone numbers were tied to Green Dot money packs. And in fact, they found a single MagicJack telephone number that had been used to register 4,000 different Green Dot money pack cards and was used with 1,200 different sets of identities. And really it was the analysis of the money packs and the MagicJack that helped them to bring together which of the call centers were related to each other. So I mentioned the H Global there. There's actually several other call centers all in Gujarat running the same type of scheme. And you can learn more about that on my blog. The link is in the notes. Another fantastic arrest, Null Crew had a particular hacker named Orbit. He had done data breaches against Bell Canada, Comcast, the State Department, University of Virginia, University of Hawaii, and it was interesting how he was apprehended. He was in a chat with a confidential informant, confidential witness, or I'm sorry, collaborating witness, and in his Skype chat, he says, 4 hours ago, I was in a bad car wreck. So the CW asks, what were you driving? And he says, oh, it was a 96 Camaro, an automatic, a V6 with a 305 engine. So the CW realizes that's enough to figure out who this guy is. So they run public record searches looking for a vehicular accident on February 7th that involved a 1996 Camaro. And sure enough, they find a 1996 Chevrolet Camaro driven by a guy named Timothy T.J. French. And French, once he was identified as a suspect, his email address and Twitter traffic all tied him back to a certain IP address, and he was able to be arrested. But I just thought that was a fascinating little tidbit on part of the investigative process there. We thought the spam was bad. It got even worse in December. In fact, Black Friday, November 25th, we believe this may be the highest spam day in history. 552 billion spam messages according to the Trend Global map. Now, I have to add the caveat there. Although a lot of that was Locky ransomware sent by the Neckhurst botnet, there was a ton of just plain old holiday shopping spam as well. Everybody with anything to sell is sending out spam for it during the holidays and especially on Black Friday. So although 552 billion did set, as far as I know, a all-time high global spam record, a lot of it wasn't ransomware. It was, hey, it's Black Friday, buy our stuff. Still, I thought it was interesting to note. Shamoon, this is kind of new, and I haven't got a lot of details yet, but you remember the Shamoon virus. Shamoon hit Saudi Aramco several years back. I believe it was 2011. And what it did was it basically disk wiped 28,000 computers over a 3-day religious holiday in Saudi Arabia. They come back in and all of their machines are wiped. And it took several weeks to recover from having 28,000 workstations and I believe 3,000 servers totally wiped. Basically, master boot record no function anymore, and the computer won't even boot. Now, in the current case, the wiper malware is copying images of the dead child who was famously seen on Time magazine, I believe it was, face down on the beach. That's the image that's being copied over and over and over on the hard drives in this current round of attacks. And the attacks, which are believed to be Iran, are hitting lots of different Saudi government organizations, including their equivalent to the FAA. So their aviation industry is one of the things that was under attack in this current wiper malware. It's been a little bit hush-hush, but there have been warnings from CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, and Symantec. So we don't know the full details, but we do know there were major attacks against Saudi Arabian companies and government agencies, and it's believed to be tied back to the Shamoon virus from, it was 2012. Best case here, and we'll spend several slides on this. This is almost the end of our presentation. The point here, the Avalanche botnet was shut down. To do this required search warrants to be served in 40 different countries, all over Europe, India, Singapore, Taiwan, Ukraine. A lot of great work was done here. What Avalanche was what's called a double fast flux infrastructure, and malware criminals could rent this infrastructure. I believe they paid $150 a week or $450 a month to have a domain or hosted on the Avalanche infrastructure. And of course, many of them had many domains hosted there. Great report from Europol that has a walkthrough of how double fast flux works. Just Google double fast flux and Europol and Avalanche, and you'll get this infographic, although it's in the show notes as well. The US CERT put out a warning, TA 16336A, about the Avalanche crimeware as a service, and they listed a bunch of the malware families that are named there. One in particular that we had reported on back in July of 2014 was called Game Over Zeus. Cutwhale was the spamming botnet here, and this is a graphic that I put together on my blog that tried to explain how this worked. And I'm not going to go into all the details here. Visit the blog, and I've got an 11-step walkthrough. But the basic idea is that the Cutwhale spammer would pay whoever's hosting this fast flux infrastructure, and then he would send out spam that advertised a link that when you clicked on it would take you to a fast flux hosted domain name. And what that means is that the name server that resolves the domain that's in the spam would change the IP address that resolves that domain every 5 minutes. So in the first 5 minutes, everybody who clicks is going to go to a certain group, usually of 10 different hosts that are all infected computers that are running the Game Over Zeus botnet. We called it NuGauze. It was a new infrastructure for Game Over Zeus. And then on those bots were all running a proxy that would proxy them through this very long randomly created .biz domain, which also was FastFlux hosted and would route the data through various additional proxies who were part of the command and control structure for the FastFlux network. Those also changed their location as often as every 5 or 10 minutes, and those all would route the traffic back to the true command and control server. I jokingly called it the evil layer of NuGauze in this illustration. In the blog post that's linked in the notes, we actually list out all of the IP addresses that resolved that particular domain. And in one, I believe it was about a 7-hour period, the evening of July 10th into the morning of July 11th of 2014, we saw that single domain name resolved to 233 different IP addresses. So just think of the complexity in trying to do an investigation like that. And in fact, we did such an investigation back in 2008, 2009. A couple great FBI agents, Paul Vitchok up at the Washington field office at that time, was working on collaring the Rockfish. And Rockfish, before Avalanche started doing malware, Avalanche was doing phishing. And in the anti-phishing working group statistics in the second half of 2009 said that they saw 126,000 fake websites. Those are the URLs. 84,000 of those sites were Avalanche domains. And so this was a little report I sent to some of the guys over in the UK about the banking Trojans in May of 2008. That day, my lab at UAB reported 37,000 different phishing URLs, but you can see that many of them, many of those phishing URLs were all going to the same domains. And so although it says 4,272 samples on text1.co.uk, there was a very long random looking host name in front of that text1.co.uk. So each of those was a unique URL, but it was text1.co.uk and .me.uk were being FastFlux hosted. And those are just some of the samples that we saw just in my lab at UAB that day. Matthew Grant, who was a student in my lab at that time, he's now a computer scientist for the FBI over in Atlanta, was the one who generated this report. I don't have a copy I can share with you, but the other interesting thing, in 2008, 2009, the big Avalanche command and control was called Gorodu.com. In 2015 and 2016, I should say, it's Gorodkov.com. So we're quite confident that the phishing Avalanche guys in 2008, 2009, after Paul Vitchok up at Washington field office shut down and arrested some of the Eastern European phishers back in May of 2009, the phishing problem, which was the focus of the case, was closed, but the Avalanche FastFlux network remained in place. And that's about the time that they switched and started doing malware hosting instead. Keith Medford out of the Houston FBI office was a huge help in this case. What we were doing is tracking the FastFlux resolutions in real time, looking for any of them that resolved to the Houston, Texas area. And Keith had volunteered that some of his team would go wherever we needed them to go to grab a currently infected machine. Because what we determined is that if you could grab a machine while it was acting as the proxy, you could find the next step upstream from it. And I'll never forget, it was the day after Thanksgiving in 2008 that we called Keith and we said, I know it's a holiday weekend, but we've got a host. And Keith's like, that's 4 miles from my house. I'm on the road. Super responsive agents, both Keith and Paul, really did a great job back on this phishing case. And the current Avalanche case was worked out of the Pittsburgh FBI field office. Keith up there, different Keith, does a fantastic job with his squad up there. How does academia fit into all this? Well, here's an example. In the Avalanche case, part of how the legal process worked was they had to seize 800,000 domain names. And why did they have to do that? Well, when they shut down all of the current Avalanche hardware, the command and control servers, the malware that was using that system would use what's called a domain generation algorithm to allow the bots to be reacquired. So the idea is if I'm an infected bot and you've just taken away my server, every day I'm going to do some math based on the current calendar and the DGA domain generation algorithm for that botnet. And I'm going to say, because today is December 15th, I'm going to contact a domain that may or may not exist, but it's this 32-digit random characters domain name. And if that domain exists, I'm going to do whatever commands it tells me to do because he's my new command and control server. So what the guys out at Fraunhofer University, Daniel Plomin is the lead of that team, and then John Bambanek up at Illinois also does great work helping law enforcement with domain generation algorithms. So a couple great academics there. These guys helped the FBI to determine what are all the near future domain names that would be generated by any of the algorithms for the malware that's currently being used, and can we go stop those domain names from being registered? Daniel presents regularly at BotConf in Paris, a fantastic botnet conference, and he has a great paper that explains more about this process there. Last note, it is December now, which means the Rule 41 has taken effect. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is similar to the ACLU, my pet name for them is the Anti-Christian Lawyers from the Underworld, but I'm in the Bible Belt, so maybe you don't share my views. But the EFF is saying that the Playpen case is allowing mass hacking by U.S. law enforcement. You've heard my case saying that what this is doing is allowing law enforcement a tool to unmask criminals that are hiding behind Tor. I think that tool is absolutely necessary. The Supreme Court and apparently the Congress agree, and it's no longer matters really what the AFF thinks. It's the new law of the land. Just like the Tor networks can be unmasked in this process, the same changes that were made to Rule 41 also allows us to deal with malware cases such as the Avalanche botnet, where we may be able to do a warrant to say we need to take action on the command and control servers in 30 different states. Well, in the past, the way the rules worked, we would have had to actually approach a magistrate in each of those 30 states and get permission 30 different times. And that in order to do an effective, timely takedown, we would need to simultaneously do that. So we would have to schedule appointments with magistrates in every state in the union on these large botnet cases and get them all to take down at the same time, or to issue their warrants all at the same time. One of the other things in Rule 41 says that in cases where there is widespread distribution across many jurisdictions, such as a malware botnet case, we can have a magistrate in a single federal location issue commands for any similar malware hosts in other locations. The EFF challenges that this may be a really bad thing. It's worth reading their side of the story, so do go look at their story. A link to the EFF link is also in the blog notes, along with my blog posts explaining what these Rule 41 changes, how do Rule 41 changes work, and what are the actual changes. So that's all we have for our year in review. I tried to keep it to under 90 minutes. I think I made that. We hope you enjoyed this presentation from the Birmingham InfraGard. Please let us know if we can be of any further service to your chapter. For details about our next meeting, please visit our website, www.birmingham-infragard.org. I'm Gary Warner at UAB, and I hope we'll be able to do this type of thing again. Thanks for your attention.